Hello and welcome to Hypervisor Migration, keeping data safe in a changing industry. Today's exciting webinar is sponsored by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Mackenzie Puddesy with Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special presentation today about hypervisor migration and how to keep your data safe in an ever-changing landscape. Change is the only true constant in the world, and your vital data center is no exception. Changing a hypervisor is not something that should be taken lightly, so when you are considering this type of switch, you need to review your data resilience strategy too. Whether you're moving between vendors or migrating to new platforms or locations, you want to keep your business running safely, securely, and without loss at any scale. That is why the experts at Veeam are here today to fill you in on best practices to make use of this technology. This is going to be such a cool conversation, and I can't wait to get started. So let's zip through the housekeeping and get things on our way. First, I want to draw your attention to the questions section of your webinar console. This is the best place to get involved, get interactive, and post all your insightful questions, comments, feedback, and ideas. We do indeed want to hear from you. So find that questions tab now, and let's start out by saying hi, hello, bonjour, hola, aloha, or whatever greeting you'd like to leave today, and give a wave to the community here at large. As a quick side note, that window is also the best place to reach out and let us know if you have any technical issues during the session. Knock on wood, of course, that doesn't happen. And don't forget that a browser refresh should get rid of the usual tech gremlins. But if not, just shoot a message in that questions tab and the ATM crew, and I will be here to help. And the last thing I want to point out on your audience console is the handouts tab. If you get eager at any point during the webinar to check out Veeam or reach out to get started with the team, you'll find their website linked in the console for an easy hop over to all things Veeam. And if all that cool content wasn't enough of a sweet giveaway, we also have a $250 Amazon gift card prize drawing at the end of our webinar. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize, and all winners must meet the Actual Tech Media Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. If you are not sure what those are, you can also find the full T's and C's linked in the handouts tab. Okay, well, that is it for the housekeeping. I told you I'd keep it short and sweet, and I think we are ready to start today's webinar. I'm so excited to introduce you all to John Anand. He is the director of the infrastructure team and Infotech research group, and also Billy Cashwell, Senior Manager, Global Product Marketing Team over at Veeam. Some of their team is on live chat, and Matt from their team will be picking some topical questions during the presentation to pose throughout. So please do toss in your questions all along the way. Don't wait until the end. And this is going to be such a fantastic session with John and Billy. So I'm going to let the Veeam team take it away. Billy, the floor is yours.
Morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And thank you again for joining us today for this fantastic conversation on hypervisor migration and how to really think about how you keep things, especially your data, safe in an ever-changing industry. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started today. We have many live humans, not just AIs in chat today, waiting to answer questions for you. So if you do have questions along the way that you just need a quick answer to, or if you want a question to be asked live, we're going to be pulling some of those and asking them during the webinar. Please feel free to put those questions into chat. This webinar is being recorded. There should be replays available at a later time. If you're not able to complete the entire webinar, no problem. And I keep calling this a webinar. John, I think we're calling it a fireside chat. You know, this is more of one of those discussions, folks, where we just have a conversation. It's not death by PowerPoint. It's not us really trying to push a lot of slides and images and graphics for you to keep up with. It's just two dummies talking about what we think with an ever-changing industry. Sorry to wrap you up in that, John. So,
if you're going to be as candid as all that, Billy,
I mean, we're being candid today, right? So John and I are good friends. I want to introduce Mr. John Anand, the Director of Infrastructure at Infotech. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thanks a lot, Billy, for having me. It's a lot of fun working with you on these things, and I'm still amazed that people want to hear our opinions on as we wax poetical on these IT
It's
topics.
crazy. John, I don't think it's so much you and I. I think it's just all the madness, the change in the news in the industry. It's got a lot of people wondering, what's going on and how do I move forward? So, John, thank you again for joining us today. Hi, folks. My name is Billy Cashwell. I'm a principal product marketing manager here at Veeam. Just like John, I actually come from more of a technical background, so don't hold the marketing title against me. I have done really nothing but data protection for almost 30 years now, which you can see by the white on my face. This is a topic that's near and dear to me. It's always in a constant state of change and flux, which just means it's an exciting industry to be in, right, John? There's never a dull moment, never a boring moment for us here.
We
So
keep
let's
wishing
dive
for
in.
dull moments, but no, they never seem to be a lot of them.
Correct. Not too many. And heck, there's not even time to take a breath anymore. I mean, it is, I think between Q4 of last year and Q1 this year, it's news, 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 and market shifts. So let's dive into some of this. So, John, virtualization change. We're actually seeing a lot about this right now. The reason why we see and hear a lot about this is because we cut our teeth here. I like to say nobody beats Veeam at virtualization. We were one of the first companies out there to really embrace virtualization, data protection, data management, backup recovery, all of those things. And, forever it was just mainly VMware. Then we
Hmm.
saw Hyper-V come about. We've definitely seen many others coming out, and now the choices for virtualization is really just sprawling, right? So there are many catalysts today, John, happening in the market. Many key drivers that are driving this change. I think one of the first ones we want to start with is just the economic factor. Think about it. The last 3 or 4 years for every business in every industry, we had a pandemic, right? We've had a pandemic. We've had military actions going on all over the place. There's just been such a shift in how we live, where we live, how we do business, how we keep our data. And a lot of the things that are going to affect how we go forward are some of the economic factors. So, John, I think I can also combine this with that second box there, market forces, big fish eating the smaller fish. We've seen a little bit of that with Broadcom and VMware lately. And I think some of those things are driving some of these economic factors. So when you
There's
see things like market forces and economic factors, what comes to mind for you? What do you think some of those big drivers are here?
So I probably still want to explore them separately. And again, sort of I'm the
Sure.
little Canadian analyst firm here, IT research firm here at Infotech. So we want to break things into their component parts. It gives us more to talk about. But in this case, I think it's the economic factor. I mean, everyone's budget is under assault. Everyone's budget is sort of getting looked at and scrutinized very, very carefully now. So it's not even necessarily that money's being cut, although we do see a little bit of that, but that notion of proving value for money, right? That's the economic factor that I see. Yes, there are sort of the macroeconomic factors about the worldwide economy and the various conflict zones that are going on and the trade relation problems that are affecting the world at large. But in the IT world, especially in the I&O world, it's really about that FinOps type mentality, right? I can go spend, $5 million a year on my infrastructure software, but I need to be
Mhm.
able to justify that. And that's what we're seeing a lot from that economic factor. How do I justify the value that that expenditure is giving the organization, or else they're going to take that $5 million and throw it somewhere else. The
And
market.
I think, I'm sorry, did I interrupt?
No, good, good.
That's a great point, and let's think about that just from a budget standpoint. I think there's a lot more things challenging IT budget than ever before, right? I mean, you just think about regulatory compliance and how long we're having to keep data and how many copies of data we're having to keep. There's many other factors driving up. So when you think about that, beyond just those base factors, are there any ancillary things that are also driving change from an economic standpoint?
I think that I mean, the fact that security is continuing to eat up a larger and larger percentage of budget, I think has to be acknowledged. It's an unfortunate arms race that's going on. Maybe the money in security isn't always being spent as effectively as possible, but realistically, what's a CIO to do when they have to go justify their existence to the board? You can't open up a newspaper, not that anyone has newspapers anymore. You can't open up your Google News feed without seeing yet another ransomware attack, right? So again, whether it's money expended directly on security incident response systems, or if it's more infrastructure systems around data protection and restore, that's really sort of crowding out a lot of the other, be it technical debt remediation or maintenance type activities that used to be the bread and butter of infrastructure and operations professionals.
And I think where you ended there, a lot of those types of things were the common cost drivers before.
Yeah.
But I see our conversation kind of getting into that market forces bucket a little bit. We've talked about Broadcom purchasing VMware. We've seen prices change there, right? And on top of that,
Broadcom bought VMware? I hadn't heard that. Is that really a thing?
I'm sorry, they acquired VMware. I think that finalized November 22nd of last year, and we're really feeling the impact of that in Q1. But we've got that, and we've got the security aspect of things. So let's unpack those in that order. Let's start with Broadcom and VMware first. So obviously, we've heard a lot about this. We think about it as ourselves from a customer standpoint. But what do you think that the biggest challenge that customers are seeing now with regards to that acquisition? Like, first and foremost, what have you been hearing from an analyst's perspective?
I mean, first and foremost, from the enterprise space, this one trying to piece into different sort of compartmentalized, easy to digest bits is really hard because it's massive. Like the size of the Broadcom acquisition is huge on its own, and then all the different areas it touches, from the partner ecosystem that Veeam plays in to the actual enterprise users that are using it to the small and medium businesses. Certainly, right off the gate, the one that everyone is talking about is the price increases. Right? VMware took some of their clients direct, sort of the top 1,000, 2,000, depending on which reports you believe. Maybe they haven't seen as much of a price increase because they're already consuming the entire portfolio. But now, because Broadcom, wants to simplify its licensing model, they've really forced people into a subscription-only model and a package model. There's no spreadsheet with 80,000 different VMware SKUs to choose from anymore. There's about 3 flavors that you can actually get. So that's forced people to buy a lot more product than maybe they've historically bought. So like individual prices might not be any more directly, but the fact that you have to buy it as a subscription, you can't use it, buy it once and use it for 10 years. And the fact that you have to buy all the ancillary extra add-ons. Again, if you use them, great value, but if you don't, that's still, or even if you do, that's still, 300%, 1,500%, 1,800% more than what you might have been paying last year.
And that's pretty substantial. You kind of talk about breaking it down by segment. From what I read, just kind of falling back on my own historics and experience, I see large enterprise and enterprise weathering that a little bit better. And actually, I don't even know if we're going to expect to see a lot of change there, just simply because just the act of shifting something that you're so built upon in your data center to another one at that scale, that's a big undertaking, right? So you kind of have to weigh that out. But as we go down to mid-market and into small businesses that we're using, everyone is using virtualization. I don't know of anyone that is not employing virtualization in some way, shape, or form. And the last time I checked, VMware owned about 80+% of that market, right, as far as market share. So, John, as it drives down to those customers, if we expect enterprise to kind of total line keep going there, how about small business and medium business? How do you see it affecting them, or even things like state, local, right, or federal?
Yeah, that's the problem with market forces. I mean, the market is great because it fuels innovation. It allows lots of different ideas to be explored, and you don't have to be an expert in them. You can just go to the market and buy a really good idea, or a really good capability, a really good technology. But the problem is that the market does what it does independent of my schedule or your schedule or the state or local government schedule. So
Yeah.
I didn't really want to plan a big, massive hypervisor migration this year. I had other things that were on my 5-year strategic plan. However, because the market has consolidated in this way, now all of a sudden my 5-year plan has been disrupted. Right? I don't know a lot of. I have the fortune of dealing, with hundreds of really, really smart, really intelligent IT professionals every year here at Infotech. I don't know a lot of them that were sitting down just, speculating and planning as a contingency. What happens if I have to change hypervisors next year?
Yeah.
Right? That's not something
And,
that's usually in somebody's back pocket.
and what a big question that is. What if I have to change hypervisor? That's tantamount to saying I've got to uproot and completely change my data center.
For sure.
I mean, if you
Right? We
if you
made a
think
choice.
about if you think about how reliant most businesses are upon virtualization, I mean, virtualization changed the world in a great way. Think about what that means, just that statement, right? If I have to change that, that's a huge business decision for me, right?
Literally
And
the underpinning of infrastructure is virtualization now.
yeah, completely. So if I'm having to think about changing that, that drives me to many other things. Does my storage have to change? Does my backup have to change? Gasp, right? Does my backup need to change? Because John, I expect some people are going to make some changes to the hypervisor that they have today. I expect some people will shift from VMware to something else.
Well, that sort of segues nicely into the last point that we've got on this slide, Billy, which is that notion of digital transformation, because that's what's supposed to have been driving change, right?
Mm-hmm.
In an idealized, and again, I don't have a Harvard MBA, although I do play one on TV on occasion, and I have the fortune to work with a great many people with MBAs. But that business first model is supposed to be business needs drive IT capabilities and all in that sort of top down type mentality. And that's what's supposed to happen, right? The hypervisor was
Right.
only supposed to change once we had digitally transformed the business into whatever new version of it, whatever new butterfly it wanted to come out of that chrysalis, right? Digital transformation projects, sort of across the board are slow. They generally go over budget. They sort of don't tend to meet their objectives or sort of their benefits realization. They've been a little stalled, I would say. Sort of,
Yeah.
and I don't think a lot of people would disagree with me over the last sort of 5 years. Right now, we have a digital transformation that's being pushed up on us. Right
Mm.
now, we have a vendor that's consolidated, or a market force out there that's saying, look, you've got to change your hypervisor. Right? So all of those digital processes that you've been building, right, all those workflows are now subject to change. So is that going to reignite the digital transformation efforts, or is that going to put the squeeze on them and put them even further behind?
It could go both ways, right? I mean, a lot of that digital transformation is a shift to cloud or to multi-cloud in some cases. So, it could definitely drive that. But as you talk about putting the squeeze on the plan and having to make different budgetary decisions, especially when you talk about a decision that's kind of being forced upon you, you're not making
Yep.
it. Someone's making a choice, and your costs are going so much that it may drive you to a change you didn't have in your plan.
Correct.
Remember, we talked about security. We talked about that little problem called malware, notably ransomware. Everybody's being beat up by that. And it's crazy because now we're seeing them as soon as they get in, John, they go directly after the backups because they know that's your emergency backup plan if it were, right? So think about this. People are already having to bolster and spend on security. And that's been in the last couple of years that has just really gone straight up like a hockey stick. Sorry for the Canadian reference. But now think about this. We're already making that kind of spend trying to get security where we need it to be and increase our security maturity and go to that next spot in the model. And now this is being forced upon us. So it really makes us stop. But, I think across the board, it's affected spending for every company in Q1. I think everybody's kind of paused right now, waiting to see. So, great discussion around what some of the drivers are there. Let's keep driving. Any final comments on this one, John, before we go to the next slide?
No, let's keep on going. We got a lot of good stuff that we know we're not going to get
Absolutely.
through because, as you can tell, Billy and I are not at all afflicted by the gift of the gab. So
Not at all. Not at all. So with everything we've talked about, let's say for you guys out in the audience that you've decided to make that change. You've decided that, I've got to move from my incumbent, I can't afford it, or, this is accelerating a different part of the digital transformation for me. Maybe I want to get to the cloud faster. This is forcing my hand there. But once you decide to change, there's many considerations that go along with that. So John, look at what we've got on the slide here. Starting with that first one, governance, risk, compliance. This is the one thing in IT that comes with pesky little penalties like prison, lots of money that you have to pay. Your name being slandered across the market, you're losing all your customers. Going out of business is where a lot of this can land. So the reason I bring up all of these things, because it's really important. When you're talking about switching hypervisors, John, you're migrating at that point, right? You're migrating data at that point. Just as if you were sending it from one site to another, you're sending it from one underpinning of an infrastructure to another one. So that's tantamount to just about migrating your data center. You can't lose data during this. You can't have data become impacted during this from, security reasons. You can't double negative. You can't not run your backups during this time, because you can't ever show up into court. I don't care if you're in the United States, Asia, Europe, and say, "Oh, I don't have that anymore. My dog ate the backup," or that just doesn't fly. These things have ramifications now. So, John, when you think about GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, and you're thinking about migrating your whole data center, what things come to mind for you? What things keep you up at night around that?
So the two big things I'm hearing from a lot of our clients, a lot of our members, is that notion of the complexity, right? And again, international obligations of organizations that, even if you exist only in one geography or one jurisdiction, almost always you have your tendril somewhere else, but assume that you only exist in the continental United States or Germany or a nice sort of, pocketed area. Even within those jurisdictions, regulatory compliance is getting harder and harder and harder, let alone now if you have to manage multiple different regulatory frameworks across most, lots of organizations are worldwide now. It doesn't take that much to have a worldwide footprint. And the
Totally.
extra obligation to understand and report on all those compliance frameworks that you're subject to, it's been so tightly tied to that hypervisor, right?
Mm-hmm.
You are allowed to inherit so much in terms of making it easier on you to manage that risk and to show those compliance efforts, because the hypervisor, was widely distributed and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of organizations were using it. So you could inherit a lot of best practices and CIS control frameworks and other things that you didn't have to come up and do from scratch, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now you're talking about, okay, now I've got to go to a new vendor. Right now, I've got to reinvent all that. I've got to try to re-inherit all of those compliance controls that I was used to just consuming. Now I've got to go vet them. I've got to validate them. Maybe I've got to build some, because not all the vendors that I might be looking at will be as sophisticated as VMware had been.
John, after you've done doing all that, you probably have to prove it and show it to someone. Not to mention the documentation that comes along with that, right? Again, coming up short saying I don't have it, I lost it, that doesn't cut it anymore.
Well, it doesn't.
And
Yeah, I was
I'm
going to
sorry,
say,
go
Billy,
ahead.
it doesn't cut it. It doesn't cut it for jurisdictional regulators. It doesn't cut it for governments or courts. But it also doesn't cut it for your own board, right? Infrastructure is the instantiation of the will, the collective opinion as to how the board of an organization wants IT to run, right? They're the
Yeah.
ones that set all the policy. Infrastructure just implements it, right? So just like we can't afford to come up short when we're reporting to a HIPAA board, or when we're reporting to an ISO standards committee, we can't also afford to come up short when our own internal stakeholders are asking us, how are you controlling, how are you mitigating these risks and these things that I've told you are important to us as an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And for everybody out there in the audience, even very small businesses do business on a global scale. People sell crafts globally. They do all sorts of things globally. and compliance exists. So know your laws, know what you're responsible for, especially before you go start moving around a lot of data. So, John, as we talk about moving that data, and let's talk about the R in GRC, reducing that risk somewhat. And I think
Yep.
that moves nicely into data security and to data integrity. And we say these two words, and I picked the two on purpose, right? Data security, making sure that that data is immutable. It cannot be changed. No one can go delete it. No one can encrypt it. But from an integrity standpoint, whatever order the ones and zeros were here, they need to be the same way here. When we turn off this data center, we have to be able to turn on this data center. And there's an analogy I stole from a friend of mine a long time ago. And the analogy was, if a company builds boats, all that matters to us as a vendor is how do we help them build more boats? I think that's the thing you have to think about here, right? You've got to make sure you're not just moving the data or recovering the data, but you can turn it back on and start building boats again when you're done. So, John, when we're talking about doing that level of migration, what are some of the key data security or integrity things that come to mind right at the gate for you?
Well, the biggest one on the data integrity side is the traditional backup problem that, for those of you who don't, I used to actually be a practitioner. I used to actually have hands-on keyboard responsibility ages ago, right? And again, we all remembered what a pain in the butt it was when we transitioned from one backup vendor to another backup vendor,
Oh,
because
yeah.
all of a sudden you lost that history, right? So it's not a matter of, okay, now I've got the new backup vendor and I really like them and I'm going to use them going forward. I still had to maintain that old ArcServe backup environment because I might need to restore something from 3 years ago, 7 years ago, until whenever my records retention policy goes away, right? So that
Exactly.
notion of the integrity is that chain, not really a chain of custody, but I think the analogy is there. You still have to have that
Mhm.
chain of security for whatever period the record is required to exist. And that's something that can easily be overlooked when you start talking about something like migrating a hypervisor. Right? If you go into something new, how do you go back to that old state? And is it just the data? Is it the state, the specific state of the VM, the patch level of VM might have been in at a given point in time? Again, what are your obligations there?
So it sounds to me that the methods and the tools that you employed to do said migration are going to be very, very important. And just as much as the process and the order in which you do it, right? So when we talk about that, the end state is returning to business as usual. Like I said, if you build boats, you want to be building boats.
Yep.
That's how you make money, right? Weeks and weeks on end of offline and not being able to bill, that is not how organizations and you guys in the audience make money. So John, we've talked about we've got to keep the risk low, we've got to keep the data safe, we've got to make sure we've got. I like chain of custody. I think that's a pretty good way to illustrate that. What's the most important thing when we roll that together to return to business as usual? For everybody out here in the audience, you've seen so many customers that have been through this type of transformation. What are a couple of key things that they should hear about, when considering returning to business as usual, getting back to building boats?
Well, the thing I'm most worried about is the potential discontinuity, right? Again, anyone that was in IT in the 90s and 2000s always had that one DRP presentation where the cost of downtime was X, and any companies that were down for longer than 3 days, 97% of them were never able to recover. They ended up going the way of the dodo, and
Yeah.
returning to business as usual is absolutely critical. But failing at any point in time is even worse, right? So in that rush to
Mhm.
return to business as usual, we can't skimp on the redundancy, on the scenario-based testing. We can't skimp on just validating that all the capabilities that the business is relying on are deployed and reliable and stable and sufficient. Right. And that's one thing that I think could easily get overlooked, especially if you're trying to go against the clock of a looming price increase because your current license subscription is up for renewal.
You know, that's crazy, John. It's almost like you're saying you should have a plan
I'm saying you should definitely have a
before you
plan.
get
Spend more
started.
time planning.
you spend a little bit of time, what is it, an ounce of prevention or, well, whatever that thing is, but
Yeah.
spend a little bit of time planning when you're thinking about doing this. And I think, as John said, don't be in a rush to do it. I think even those of you that are deciding change, even leaving VMware for financial or other reasons based on some of the changes post acquisition, I think all of you, you've probably still at least renewed a year, have a year left. You've got a little bit of time to think. Do this right, right? It's worth doing right to getting back to building and building boats. So, John, fantastic intro and discussion. Let's get into a little more direct and pointed points of discussion here.
Excellent.
So, when we talk about migrating, talking is fun. As we talk about migrating your business, look at that question underneath it. Is your data center portable? Back in the day, you'd think about loading everything in a truck and moving it from one building to another. Those things still happen. But in the case of what we're talking about here, we're talking about potentially shifting your data center in the same spot, just to a different underpinning. And that has really far reaching ramifications and benefits as well, right? It's not a bad thing. This is all for good reasons.
Well,
So,
when you think sorry,
yeah,
Gil,
go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, if you
No,
think about it like historic ways that we used to migrate our data centers, we used to use VMware to do that. We used to use the
yeah.
hypervisor to enable that migration. And again, if we talk about any sort of project estimation technique, right? One of the things you always want to do is you want to look to past projects that you've done successfully to see how long they took, and that's your model to how long these new projects are going to take. Okay, I used to
Hmm.
move the data center, I used to transfer it using the hypervisor. I don't have that crutch anymore, right? I don't have that
Right.
experience. I don't have that tool. I'm actually migrating the data center, as you said, in place by lifting it up, ripping out the hypervisor, and putting in a new one, right? That's a radically different project than the old ways I used to worry about, migrating the data center. So even if you think you're comfortable, even if you think you're confident, it's like, I remember how to move data centers. I was doing it for ages. We just moved a bunch of data centers to the public cloud. This is a radically different version of
Yeah.
that migration. You're not going from VMware on-prem to VMware on AWS. You're not going from VMware at NTT Data to VMware at Rackspace, right?
Yeah.
You're changing some fundamental things here.
Absolutely. And right there at the end, you talked about all those different permeations that you could go into and different places you could go. And we like to call that data freedom. That's a notion that we have at Veeam to talk about. Your data has got to be free to go where your business needs it to go, when it needs it to go, regardless of scale or location, right? So look at this first question here. I think something you guys in the audience really have to think about is the solution you're using today, whether it's a backup, data protection, migration tool, however you're thinking about it. Can you move a whole business between hypervisors, whether it's on premises to on-prem, whether it's staying in place like John and I were talking about, or maybe it's getting that next stage of digital transformation and ending up in the cloud? Can you do that with your current solution without any loss of fidelity? Think about this. And John, we were talking about this the other day. The core, and I think this is something you actually said, the core to a modern data protection strategy lies in the portability of the data. Specifically, in the case of recovery, the portability of that backup. Tell me more about that.
Well, see, that's one thing that we might have, like, of all we talked about sort of the market forces and woe is me and things are going up and change is bad and I'm scared and it's risky. There is a couple of silver linings here. And one
Mm-hmm.
of them is that modern data protection products, Veeam included, have realized that, you're not a one-trick pony. Yes, you might have started off with VMware, but then you quickly had to, as you said, you had to embrace Hyper-V. You had to embrace Nutanix when it came out. You had to embrace, Linux or OpenShift, and then Kubernetes. Right? Modern data protection platforms have brought together all those different environments. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I maybe, as the enterprise infrastructure and operations leader, I maybe don't have to be an expert in that because hopefully I've already partnered with somebody like Veeam who has that data protection platform at its core and already has the ability to go from one environment to a new environment.
Right.
Right. And that's really where it's that loss of fidelity. Like cloud, the best case for cloud infrastructure as a service has been and remains backup, right? And
Absolutely.
disaster recovery, right? So the
Absolutely.
fact that I don't have to have another data center located, 35 odd miles away or 50, whatever the minimum radius is for a hurricane, right? That I don't have to do that myself. I can just fail that over to a on-demand public cloud instance if the meteor hits my own personal data center, right? That's what modern data protection platforms have allowed us, really for about the last, 5 sort of 6 years. The orchestration on that is hard. I'm not trying to minimize that in any
Right.
way, shape, or
For sure.
form.
But
But
it's
again,
possible.
it's possible.
And I think that comes into the plan, right? Thinking and writing this down and sketching it out, making a plan of how you're going to go through with this. So, a lot of the things we were talking about in that last question really came down to breadth of choice. One of the things you said is, does the solution I have today support the platform that I'm moving to?
Sure.
Because if it doesn't, guess what? You're not migrating your platform, or I'm sorry, your data center, your virtualization platform, if you will. You're also going to have to switch your backup vendor. And that's huge. I mean, and I'm not saying that because we're a backup company. I've done this a long time. And most companies out there that I've dealt with, including myself, that's the last thing we want to mess with. That's our insurance policy, right? So the fact that one could support both where I'm coming from and where I'm going to can help. So think about this next question. Can you both securely and, of course, reliably recover your data and applications? It's not just about putting data back anymore. You've got to be able to put an application back and it turn on and function. But can you do that to any hypervisor or any location? It's really about choosing your own adventure these days, John. I mean, think about all the choice you've got. What are your thoughts here?
Well, again, I'm going to reach back into the nostalgia bag and I'm going to ask people to remember their disaster recovery planning scenarios and their tabletop exercises. How often did that uncover a potential problem about an order of operations? Oh, we've got to make sure the DNS server is restored first. Oh, look, there is no proper IP address management, right? It's all just hard coded and it's on somebody's Excel spreadsheet, or worse, it's on some sticky note that's in a data center that's no longer there anymore, right? In terms of what the IP addresses or some of the credentials and the secrets management, right? Let alone the tabletop exercise when you actually went through hopefully a test, if not an actual disaster recovery, and the lessons learned, right? All those little interconnects that the enterprise architecture team at the high level didn't document or didn't forget or forgot about or didn't bother with because they were at 50,000 foot and these are like 5-foot level type details, right? All of those, as you said, I don't have an excuse. They have to work. They have to, stand up. The application has to run properly the first time I instantiate in that new environment, right? So again, I want to go back to those good planning and scenario-based evaluations that we all know how to do. That maybe we've pulled the foot off the gas a little bit in recent times.
Yeah, I think that's fair. You mentioned tabletop exercises. The only time I hear tabletop exercises mentioned anymore, security.
Right.
That's really the only time I hear, and I'm not saying, I mean, you guys out there, the customers in the trench, the people in the trench, right? Better than I do, but that's the only time I hear those words anymore. So maybe it's time we get back to some of the basics and start thinking about just, if you're doing this migration, you should sit there and plan that, we've talked about planning it out, but do some table exercise. Think about what are all the what if scenarios. This is your business, your data. Quite frankly, for all of you sitting here looking at us, it's your job, right? That's on the line when we're doing these things. We've got to do it right. And, let's look at the last one. When we think about doing it right, what are the business needs? I mean, if we're going to make this type of change, if we're deciding to shift, it's like opening the hood of a car. We've got it open. What else do we need to do? Were there any shifts in how we do business, how we operate that you need to consider from an IT perspective, how you align to as you make this migration? Think about everybody's got some cloud first edict out there, John, right? Everything new starts in the cloud. From a CEO stands that perspective, but down in the trench, they're like, really, I don't know if that makes sense. But let's think about that. When
yeah,
that is
that's
part of the edict, you can't let something like your backup solution dictate that. You've got to have something that can go to more than one location, especially off-site.
And that's the one I want to take a pot shot at, Billy, right? Because it is, we all know that lift and shift and in-place sort of upgrades, it's not cost effective, right? It's really, really expensive. You're not going to get the value, right? Even if the business gave you a cloud first mandate 8 years ago and you lifted and shifted, I guarantee you the CFO started knocking on your door probably about 3 years ago saying, why are we spending this much money again every month? What value am I getting from it? Right. So again, moving to a new environment has to be aligned to the business needs. There's very little sense in picking everything up, reconfiguring it, reimagining it, planning it, testing it, successfully migrating, and then turning it up on day 2. If that's not an environment that the business is going to want to be in for a long time.
I think that's fair. And as we've gone through some of these, I've seen some chatter, I've seen some questions coming in. Matt, do we have any questions that have come in through the chat or through the Q&A so far? I just want to pause here. It's a good time to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got 2 questions I think would be beneficial to address live here. The first one is, what are some of the alternative hypervisors or cloud options that you see customers evaluating?
Cool.
John, you want to take this?
Yeah, okay. So I'll take a stab at that one again. An area that I've been following in my research here at Infotech. We sort of organize them into 5 big buckets, right? You've got the public cloud IaaS services, the AWSs, the Azures, the GCP of the world, right? The cloud, but just the off-prem clouds, right? Another way of looking at it. You've got the hyper-converged players, right? You've got the Nutanixes, the Scales, the Starwinds. They were the darlings sort of 5, 6 years ago, moving away from that sort of N-tier architecture. And Proxmox is another one in there, right? You've got these converged hardware-based systems. They all came out of storage, interestingly enough, because storage was the hardest part to do live in terms of replication. That's the other sort of big group of possibilities we see. And then to round out the 3, maybe a little bit more aspirational, we've got container-based ecosystems, right? What if you take those VMs and instead of remaining VMs, you break them down and you refactor those applications into proper stateless containers, right? Whole lot more work, but maybe a whole lot more potential value.
At least for the long run, right? Yeah.
Well, again, and not necessarily always, right? There's lots of great examples of applications that don't need or would never benefit from the effort to transform, right? They're doing their job and they just need to keep on doing that job. As much as Harvard MBAs and people on stages or people in webinars or fireside chats want to say that there's this pace of change and everything has to change all the time. There are lots of things that we wrote once and they're good for 15 years, 20 years, right? They do exist. They're not maybe the majority, they do exist.
I think Matt still uses RoboCopy, so that's totally true. Right?
Nothing wrong with that.
Matt, speaking of you, you said there was another question, and thank you, John.
Yes, Billy, this one probably be for you. Probably the most popular question any Veeam employees had for the past few months. When will Veeam support Proxmox?
There we go.
It's that W question again. When is different, but I'll tell you this. I can't tell you when exactly. I can definitely say stay tuned. At Veeam, we pride ourselves on breadth of hypervisor support. Just last week, we announced support for Oracle Linux Virtualization Manager, so more KVM support there. We've already talked about, we are looking into Proxmox heavily now, as well as additional hypervisors and which of those can be backup sources. So if that's something interesting to you, stay tuned to Veeam and definitely check us out at VeeamON this year in June. So great questions. Matt, if there's no more, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide just to keep it going for time. Okay, I'm going to keep trucking here. All right, John, we talked about, we're thinking about migrating. We're getting ready to migrate if we're going to do it. We're actually migrating. Now we are, hitting some buttons there. Now the migration's complete. We want to return to a steady state of business. So let's take these one by one. Take a look at that statement around operations that we put together. And I think you've touched on this before, even when you were just talking about some of those things on Post-it notes or decisions or old architecture, things that should have been documented. But all of those workloads, how do you continue to leverage them even though your data is moving around? What should customers think about that?
Well, again, this goes, how far are you down that automation route? How far are you down
Oh, yeah.
that orchestration route? Because operations isn't just an I&O thing anymore, right? The security team has direct access to my infrastructure environment. The applications team probably has direct access to my infrastructure environment. I've put some guardrails on, but in the old environment, I had these self-service portals, or I had these ways where an applications engineer didn't have to create a ticket in ServiceNow to wait for me to provision a machine, right? We had automation and workflows. So how are you going to continue? Can you use those same automation tools or frameworks in your new environment?
I think
Right?
that's
Because it's not
fair.
just about the data. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, totally. And we're seeing a heck of a lot more automation take place. I mean, heck, VMware itself, look at how much automation was built into that. I mean, you talked about the beginnings of things like vMotion, in the earlier on in this call. So automation is existing everywhere. And I think that's a good call out because people are working their own automation into things now. How else
Right?
are you going to scale?
It's not about my automation as an I&O. I mean, that's important, but I'll figure that out. Like, that's no problem. That's internal baseball. You'll get it
Right.
done. I have all the faith in every I&O person on this call. You'll get that done. Now, how do you go renegotiate that operational automation, that operational sharing of responsibility with the apps team, the firewall team, the data scientist team with all the AI stuff that's out there, the business users? Like, again, that's where it's going to get messy, right? Like,
So
we don't like change. They like change even less.
yeah, I think that's fair. So the least amount of disruption there is definitely desirable. I think I got that. Let's talk about the kind of something that I consider an elephant in the room, and that's training, or I don't want to say training, but look, I've got proficient there. I've written how much training is needed to return to a proficient state of usage, and I use proficient on purpose because you don't have 6 months to learn a new solution while you're trying to protect your data, fighting off cyber criminals, trying to keep your business running while you're building boats and trying not to sink. See what I did there? How important is ease of use and or little training needed when you're thinking about migrating and or changing solutions?
I mean, there's lots of ways you can supplement training. Managed service providers are a great option
Mm.
for many enterprises to lean on to get some expertise. Um, the short term, 100% lean on your managed service provider, lean on your vendor, because you're right, Billy. You're not going to be able to put a 6-month training program into an abbreviated migration plan. Again, especially if you're getting squeezed because of the license expiry.
Right.
But this should spur on a change in your internal IT training, right? Like, now, where do
Mhm.
you want to invest? Maybe it's not as much with the vendor. Maybe, once bitten, twice shy. Realize that these are these market forces things. Maybe I don't need to invest all my training dollars into a particular vendor, but more in more agnostic technology, something that's a little bit broader than just one vendor's certification pathway. I mean, everyone likes logos after their name, but at some point, you want something that is able to transition from vendor to vendor to vendor, or from enterprise to enterprise to enterprise that you might work at.
Totally. So, as we talk about transitioning between things, I'm going to roll these last two together. One thing that remains a constant is law, regulation, and the need to be compliant to them, right? No matter what you change, who you're using, any of that stuff, this stuff remains constant. And you've talked about this before, right? We made the joke of documentation and how important that is. I mean, just you talked about the pain in the butt documentation or lack thereof can be if older teams don't document changes they made. Now we're talking about regulatory compliance and being able to document that you can test, that you can recover, that you can get this data back. And on the story of recovery, you've already mentioned this once.
Yeah.
If you have to change your backup solution, you've got to keep the other one around. And that could be for 7 years, 10 years, 15 years, depending on what compliance that you adhere to. Any thoughts around these, or anything to add to that?
Just don't make it a resume generating event. Make sure you check with legal to find out what your compliance obligations are beforehand. I mean, that's really what there's no secret sauce here, right? Legal knows what your compliance obligations are. Don't guess. Get them involved. Get them to own the answer to that. You can only implement it as much as you're told. So
I can't stress that enough. Get legal involved. If you're a small business and you don't have legal on staff, I'm sure you have someone that you trust in compliance law that you can reach out to. Ignorance is not a defense. You cannot get up there and claim ignorance as a defense in the event that you are skipping anything on compliance. So, John, let's keep it going for the sake of time, and let's round this out here. So now that we've talked about some of the things that you've got to consider, some of the things you got to plan for, moving your data, now it's time to say we've moved it, we've got to operate the business. And in order for us to get back to building boats, I'm going to ask you, take us through some of these items here on this slide, if you don't mind, and give us your commentary on how important these things are to not allow you to just recover or migrate, but to actually bounce forward and get back to business, get back to building boats. So take us through these for a moment and tell us what you think about them.
Sure. So that's the trite euphemism or syllogism that infrastructure has lived by forever, right? Never waste a good crisis, right? And again, let's lean into that old lesson that we all sort of learned, 10 or 20 or 30 years ago, depending on how long you've been in this business, right? This is a big opportunity for change. It's being forced on you by these market conditions. But what can I get out of it for me, right? I've wanted to drive that digital transformation project. I've wanted to get out of VMs and into proper containers, right, and Kubernetes. Can I use that to advance this? I've wanted to get out of that old reactive posture of monitoring, where I've got to send out requests and wait for packets to come back. And I want to move into telemetry and observability, right? What can I do to again, not just have a like-for-like transition from what I used to operate yesterday before Broadcom bought VMware, but what new capabilities, what new efficiencies, what new risk reduction can I drive to my organization? Since I've got to go through this big change anyway, why don't I take advantage of it as much as I possibly can?
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Right? Move away from data backup to replication. Move away from again backup to proper protection. I mean, and the last point, no infrastructure person will probably ever argue with this. Great chance to decommission things that you don't need anymore. Right? That almost never happens.
Or at least modernize them in some way, get them off the old iron, right? But like you said, it's almost, John, I'm hearing you say, take a moment to do some spring cleaning while you're doing this, right? How often do you lift the hood of the car to do the work? So
that's it, 100%. This is a massively disruptive event. You don't get a chance you don't get forced to do it. Since you're being forced to do it anyway, let's take the chance. Let's get as much out of that effort and that pain as we possibly can. Let's rip off a bunch of different Band-Aids.
And, you talked about monitoring this, making sure your procedures work. I mean, we've got day 2 workflows here, basically making sure, once you've installed it, you've set it up, you want to make sure that it's running good, it's optimal, you're doing all these types of things. You talked about, I made the joke about spring cleaning. You talked about now's the time to introduce new things. I think that the same thing applies to automation as well. Every organization, everybody out there looking at us on this call, you're being asked to scale. Everybody here, I mean, the workforce is hard. I know for years we've said do more with less, but it is real right now. It is very real and felt by everybody on this call. So I think automation is another thing that people can go take a look at. And John, we need to keep front and center in our minds the solutions we're choosing. How much can we automate them? Do they, can we do it easily on our own? Is it PowerShell? Is it Puppet or Chef or something like that? And then, finally, like you said, I love that comment on decommissioning things, being able to say, do we need this anymore? And heck, for regulatory compliance, if you don't need it, get rid of it, period.
If the only thing that comes out of this is your ability to jettison a bunch of dead weight of your old data center, and again, the hypervisor changeover is that catalyst for change, then that's still going to be a massive win.
Absolutely. So when we're decommissioning things, Matt, you may even have to stop using RoboCopy out there. But Matt, on that note, before we wrap things up, any questions on this slide or the previous one that have popped up, or anything in general?
Yeah, there's a good question here. Are there any frameworks or methodologies that we should be looking at when it comes to validating workflows?
So, John, what's your thoughts on this? They have workflows they were using before. We're talking about this as an opportunity to not just modernize and from a digital transformation standpoint, but to also review workflows and how you do things. What's the best way do you recommend, or what have you seen people do to actually validate and figure out what's best here?
Well, this one's actually kind of fun. I think it's the TM forum. There's an automations forum, and there was recently a networking automation conference down in Colorado. The whole notion of automation and AI-driven automation, of course, because it has to be AI. We're required by law to say that in the analyst community about 18 times an hour, it feels like. So both of those organizations have frameworks to help you map out all the steps in an automation, all the steps that you would have to go through to validate that the work is going to happen, right? At the core of it, everyone is most concerned about making sure that if I'm going to automate the process is already as lean and proper and its best possible form, because there's 0 point, and there's actually all sorts of negative points you get for automating bad processes, right?
Yeah, so you're kind of saying really put bloat front and center and think about how much you can refine things. So that's another, I think that's the gold nugget right there for everybody, John. As you're reviewing these processes and workflows, how can you refine them? How can you make them more efficient?
Look at the TM forum. Again, they've been doing it for a long time. Even this network automation conference, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head.
And then finally, you really get to connect with people like yourself. You get to hear from subject matter experts. You get to hear from visionaries and external speakers. So whether you're able to attend with us in person or just attend virtually, we'd love to have you here and talk more about how we can help you as you go through these transformations and what's coming next and exciting for Veeam. So John, special thanks to you. I cannot thank you enough. It's always a pleasure when we get to talk. Thanks for taking the time today just to tell people what to think about, not what to buy, but what to consider when you're going through this change. So thank you again so much. And thank you to each of you for spending time with us today.
Love that wrap up. You're here to tell people what to think about and not what to buy. It takes a certain confidence to say that. Hey, come listen to us and buy anything you like. And I, for one, always appreciate the open gift of information. John and Billy and team, you've been such a joy to listen to. It's clear from the audience response and engagement that this topic is one that many are thinking about, worried about, excited about. Either way, it is an important one to be discussed. Alrighty, I think that puts us at time. So any of your questions that were not brought up in the session, they will be taken away and answered by the team over at Veeam. So do not fret. They have not gone to waste. That said, we do have a poll here. So if any of you would like to be contacted by the Veeam sales team and learn a little bit more, feel free to opt in yes, and they'll make sure you get the information in a timely manner. And if you don't want to be contacted, no worries, plunk that in the poll as well. Now, everyone out there, I hope that you had as much fun as I did and learned as much as I did. I want to remind all of you to visit the handout section if you want to get started right away and hop over to Veeam's website. Or again, the poll is probably just as good if you do want to have a bit of a hands-on approach, and then you'll be reached out to by the sales team. Now, before we wrap up, we do have a little bit more fun to add, and that is a prize. You've all been sitting here patiently listening to this awesome presentation, but we do have a $250 Amazon gift card to give away. And with that, I do want to remind you, you must be present and live here at the webinar in order to be eligible for the prize. And the prize is going out to Judy Clemens from Louisiana. A huge congratulations to you, Judy. And again, thanks for being on the webinar. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Veeam for making this webinar possible. And especially, I want to thank our incredible speakers, John and Billy, who have given us so much to think about today. And hey, sending high fives and special thank yous to all of you out there with us for making this possible. I know sometimes it can be difficult to stop our daily grind, take a moment to strategize and plan ahead. And I am glad you took the time to learn about hypervisor migration and keeping data safe in a changing industry. I know I have learned a ton from this session today, and I hope you all have as well. I can't wait to see you at a webinar again soon. And until then, I hope you have an absolutely magical rest of your day. Take care.